hundreds of times. And there's a theme in blues that we hear, we don't necessarily think about what we're hearing, when people say, my baby done left me, implying that she went somewhere. And not simply that she's no longer in the house with you, but that she's gone somewhere. And so, even when kind of Jimi Hendrix did the cover that noted blues song, Red House, it says, there's a red house over yonder, that's where my baby stay. I ain't been home to see my baby in 99 1/2 days. And so we get in this kind of theme of people moving, and it reflects exactly what happened in the history, what the historical record shows us, which is that black people were preoccupied with the concern of post-emancipation finding those who had been sold away from them. And then understanding emancipation simply is the right to be someplace else, and no one being able to dictate your own mobility. What does the 13th Amendment mean? What does the 14th Amendment mean? And the blues reflects that. And then at the end of the 20th century, the predominant form of cultural expression we see is hip-hop. And in hip-hop, we don't see that theme of mobility. We see a different theme that replaces it, and that is the theme of the ghetto. And we find that word pop up again and again and again. If you were to kind of trace the word ghetto in hip-hop, you find it all over the place. But it's also when we get the fierce regionalism that defines the music, where everyone's talking about their own specific hood. But they're talking about it precisely for the opposite reason that people talk about the blues, for the lack of mobility. So hip-hop is the narration that you get from someone who can tell you everything that has happened in their community because they've been in that community for their entire lives. And so it's the worldview of somebody who, the narration, the in-depth narration of someone who's been in the same place for 20 years is defined by the exact opposite. And so the relationship between blues and hip-hop is a relationship between journeys and destinations, and between departures and arrivals. And so blues tells us what happens when black people set out and what carried us through the Great Migration, and hip-hop tells us about what happened once we got in cities and found ourselves trapped there once again. There's another theme that connects blues to hip-hop, to this question of the hip-hop hijack black culture. There's another theme that hip-hop really reached back to the blues and found, and it's something that we'd almost forgotten, and that is the centrality of narration. And so blues is the preeminent storytelling art form in American culture. And so you listen to blues because the person's going to tell you a story, you're going to glean from the blues, from the story, a moral, or something that's applicable to your life. And then that kind of fades out of music. Kind of more popular music, we have the emphasis on ballads, the emphasis on love, the emphasis on kind of ephemeral things. But hip-hop returns that. In hip-hop, you find the preeminence of someone's ability to tell a story as being one of the criteria by which they evaluate it. So if someone was talking about Slick Rick or someone was talking about Biggie, you encounter them as people who narrate. That is their lyrical strong suit, to take you from one place, point A, and then bring you to point B at the end of the song, or point D or F or G or wherever it is that you find yourself. And so, in so doing, hip-hop draws upon a kind of slate of characters that is indebted to the blues for. The easiest of the characters, there are 4 or 5 of them that we could talk about, but the easiest of the characters, being mindful of our time, is the bad nigger. And so we know in hip-hop in blues, there's a theme of the black person, of the man telling his story, the Stagger Lee figure, the person who's completely impervious, the person who's impregnable, the person who has the capacity to kind of weather whatever society throws at them. And of course, this character with these superheroic qualities is appealing to a group of people who are oppressed and exploited. He reflects the highest ideal, people whose relationship is defined by the constant threat of lynching, of disfranchisement, of physical retaliation from white people. It makes perfect sense that a figure like Stagger Lee or Railroad Bill or any of the outlaw characters that populate the blues and black mythology have these invulnerable qualities. And so hip-hop reached back for that. And so when we find the narration of the person who in the 1990s came to be termed the gangster rapper, what they actually were talking about was the highest ideal of an oppressed and exploited people is to have someone who can't be oppressed and can't be exploited. Even if it's in a kind of suicidal audacity, this person that cannot be compromised by a system that compromises the rest of us. And so hip hop has this relationship too. And so this kind of narrative thread that ties these things together, when my father came up from Georgia, he came from a little place in Georgia called Hazelhurst. Raise your hand here if anybody has ever heard of Hazelhurst. And so it's funny, because I can be in Georgia, and I lived here for 11 years, and it was like still, Hazelhurst is so small, even the majority of people in Atlanta are like, oh, wait, Hazelhurst, never heard of that. When my father came from Hazelhurst to Harlem, he brought with him these poems, but he committed to memory. And as a young person, I thought this was fascinating that he could tell these stories, just one after another after another. They all, kind of were in rhyming form, and they all told the stories of kind of urban street life. One of which was Face on the Barroom Floor, which tells the story of two young men who decide they're going to become bank robbers together, and they commit all of these crimes, and then one goes to jail and tells on the other one and to get out, and then the other one goes away for years. And so the first one who's told goes on to have this prosperous life, and 20 years later his old criminal partner tracks him down across the country for retribution. And my father has this whole story committed to his memory. And I'm thinking that this is just him, but it's actually reflective of a whole cultural thing, that there are black men who have these stories that come from the South to the North. And so they bring this kind of narration to the North, and they're physically transmitting what becomes the basis for hip hop. So it literally, physically comes from the South with us. And so this is the other way that hip hop reaches back to make this connection. And the final way that I want to talk about, there are a couple of things that I may play. Just to kind of illustrate this, the final thing that I want to talk about is the way that hip hop connects to the tradition of black autobiography. And inside this idea of narration. So, autobiography in this country, black autobiography begins in this country with slave narratives, which are told for an explicit political purpose. And there's a kind of arc to the slave narrative, which tells of the depredations of slavery, the perils of attempted escape, and in graphic detail tells about the physical violence associated with slavery, the sexual violence associated with slavery, and then the eventual trajectory toward freedom. In the 20th century, black autobiography kind of takes a different form, and we find a different set of hallmarks. And I won't go through all of it at this time, but if we say we can use Malcolm X as kind of an example of where black autobiographies, particularly black male autobiography, the touchstones of black male autobiography in the 20th century. And that is, with Malcolm X, he starts by talking about the circumstances of his birth, talking about the circumstances under which his house becomes a fatherless household. In this instance, the death of his father at the hands of the Klan. He tells about the subsequent impoverishment of the family and the adolescent foray into crime, and then incarceration. And then where the slave narrative told of freedom from slavery, Malcolm X's narrative tells of freedom from physical bonds of prison and the psychological bonds of racism, and also redeeming oneself by using the skill set that you learned in the illegal economy. And so when Malcolm talks about what made him such a good proselytizer for Elijah Muhammad is that he understood how to talk to people, which is the skill set he picked up on the streets. And so if we looked at Black Boy by Richard Wright, if we looked at Man Child of the Promised Land, if we looked at Makes Me Wanna Holler, if we looked at Monster Cody Scott, his autobiography, we find those kind of themes again and again and again. We can see those things play themselves out. But what we don't notice is that the next installation in that is hip hop. And so when we listen, when people look back 50 years or 100 years from now, and they want to know where the most salient black autobiography, black male autobiography is, they'll be looking at the intro to Ready to Die. They'll be looking at Illmatic, which is the entire CD is an autobiography. They'll be looking at this slate of songs we could go through. Big Boy at West Savannah, where he talks about the circumstances in which he's born. Or Pimp C from UGK, who narrates the circumstances of his life continually. Jay-Z, where he talks about the experience of growing up in the housing projects, the Marcy projects in Brooklyn, and who he became as a result of that. And the one thing that you find in this is not only the impoverishment, the fatherlessness, the incarceration, but also the capacity to survive in the music industry based upon a skill set that they learned as crack dealers, or that they learned on the street in the illegal economy. And so I say all those things to say, to just lay out those are my arguments, to say that in response to the question, is hip-hop hijack black culture? The answer is no, because you can't hijack something that you've already inherited. So I'm going to stop there. I actually have some songs and stuff, but I don't want to